So this is how it's going to work. I'm going to do the first 4 films. I'm not doing even numbers. It's my top 14 best and my bottom 10 worst. But once I get to the top 10, it'll just be head-to-head, play a song head-to-head. So the 10th best, 10th worst, and so on. And that's going to be the way all the way through. Also, another thing is, every year we have this problem, which is us not being America here. A lot of the best films of the year come out in January for the awards season. And they're really part of last year's conversation, but they're always the best films of the year. So it's always, do I include those 5 films that came out in January to be nominated for the Oscars, even though they were kind of last year's and they were shown at festivals but not given a wide release. So that would be doubly problematic this year, as if I included pretty much any of those films, it would wipe the floor with what came out after January. So I have got one big one in there, but that's because it only was released widely in the cinema for a brief period of time from the 25th of December, and it was only released internationally on Netflix on the 31st of January, so it really is a film from this year. Something like Parasite I'm not including. Parasite did the majority of its box office this year, especially around the Oscars, but it was being released in festivals from June last year, so it doesn't count. But one has snuck through the net. So without further ado, I'm going to start at number 14 with Bacurau from a Brazilian director called Kleber Mendonça Filho, and he's stepping up to be one of the most internationally revered directors. He's done quite a few films, but only a couple of major ones, and they've both won a lot of awards. This won the Special Jury Prize at Cannes. It's a version of The Most Dangerous Game / Hunger Games, where rich people are hunting poor people out in the north of Brazil, in the interior of Brazil, in the Red Earth, and it also throws in large corporations and their mistreatment of Brazilian villagers in rural settings to get their environmental destruction, to get the goods from the land and so on. All very timely themes, particularly in right-wing Brazil at the moment, where ecological calamities are happening because they're, raping and pillaging the land to benefit large corporations under the guidance of their wonderful prime minister or president. It's got a lot of acclaim, but it was overrated. It was pretty wild at times. The soundtrack was excellent, and it jumped around a lot, but it was also very flat. The cast wasn't very good. A few people were reasonably good, but that was about it. Everyone else was pretty amateur hour. I thought it took a long time to get where it was going. By the time it got into the Hunger Games element, I thought that it would have been better off staying a drama about this town being, turned over to large corporations and politicians letting them down. I would have actually been happier. And when it does, it doesn't kick off enough. We've seen The Most Dangerous Game, the story about humans hunting other humans, portrayed in many films and books throughout. I mean, The Hunger Games is the most prominent of this century, but The Hunt came out either this year or last year. That had more to say about The Most Dangerous Game than this did. This didn't really add anything to it. It was rich people hunting poor people with no embellishment and no backstory and nothing to it. So I didn't think it brought enough to the table. I thought when the villagers fought back in the denouement, I was expecting something like, one of the old Django movies. It was just a bit too tepid across the board. Not enough happened, and it didn't happen wild enough for me. It was all a bit of a letdown. But it was still great fun, beautifully, vividly colourful, and dynamically directed, and here's a name to look out for. At number 13, Love and Monsters. I hate young adult films more than anything in cinema, including rom-coms, but I hate romantic young adult films. So I didn't sit down to watch Love and Monsters by Michael Matthews with any hope at all of not hating it, but I loved it. It was, curiously, it wasn't a sour-faced Twilight Maze Runner po-faced seriousness. It was, and it wasn't bombastic. It didn't knock you over the head. It was actually the perfect middle ground. The lead character by Dylan O'Brien was a whiny runt. He was wonderful. He was really good. I don't know how he managed to pull that off, but he grew throughout the film so that by the end, you actually respected him. And the fact that Jessica Henwick, who I picked out earlier in the year as a massive star of the future, she's beautiful, she's got the talent, she's electric on screen, she was great in Underwater from tepid, boring Kristen Stewart. She, like, when you first see her, no way is Dylan O'Brien up to her at all. But by the end, he's gone through these courageous, growing moments, and I actually really warmed to him. Great special effects, doesn't overdo the monsters, uses them at perfect moments, and it's also soulful and moving. At number 13, that was Love and Monsters. At number 12, The Colour Out of Space, which is the latest adaptation of the H.P. Lovecraft novel. Good to see him getting a lot of attention lately. This one by Richard Stanley, who hadn't worked for 30 years after being kicked off the island of Dr. Moreau, one of the most famous troubled projects in movie history. I think they've made entire documentaries about it. He hadn't worked again, but he came back with this very sure-footed entry into the modern horror. It wasn't quite as crazy as I hoped it would be, especially with Nicolas Cage in the lead. I said we're in the age of Cage. He's making the comeback. I seriously think he's one of my favourite actors. But compared to something as mind-blowingly brilliant as Mandy, a lot of this was ordinary until we got to the point. But it was still very good, and it was still well shot, dramatic. I thought Cage might have overdone it a little bit, and I thought it could have got zanier. But by the last third, it got really colourful and very upsetting visuals and disturbing, which is what I signed up for. So I was happy. It was still a really good film, just nothing as crazy as Mandy. And the final in this burst, my number 11 film of the year, Aaron Sorkin's Trial of the Chicago 7. It will probably get some notice around Oscars time. As an Aaron Sorkin project, I thought it was better than whatever the film that he made last time was. Molly's Game, which was very underrated, but a good writer might be a good writer, but that doesn't mean they're a good writer of a screenplay. He writes brilliant scripts, but that screenplay on that was far too wayward. Here, he's trimmed it down, and it works much better. It was a great film. I felt like it just should have stepped into being a bit more edgy, whereas the last third felt a bit more Spielberg and Ron Howard than the rest of the film had, and it felt like it was reaching for those Oscar-worthy emotional notes. Still a great film, brilliant script, hugely interesting subject about the trial of the Chicago 7, and very timely, and I reckon an Oscar nomination. Eddie Redmayne was really good, and so was... It's an amazing cast. Joseph Gordon-Levitt, Michael Keaton, Frank Langella. Eddie Redmayne was great, Mark Rylance was great, but I reckon an Oscar nomination for the star, Sacha Baron Cohen. I mean, you go from 1 week, it was Borat came out, and then I think a week later this came out. He is superb in this film. So that's my number 11 film of the year, and we'll go head-to-head after this. You're with Julian on the Brownout, counting down my best and worst films of the year. From now on, it's going to be my 10th worst, my 10th best, all the way through to number 1, going head-to-head. And the way the worst films works, I don't choose 10 films that I gave 1 out of 10 to. Have I got... Yeah, so I haven't got Hard Kill on, which I gave a 0 out of 10 to, because it was a non-entity. It wasn't even a film that registered anywhere. So I've got a lot of controversial choices in my worst films. Usually there'll be fairly big films, fairly important films. A lot of the time there'll be films that have got incredibly good reviews, and I've just disagreed. Or they've been a massive letdown dependent on the director or a number of other factors. Without further ado, my 10th worst and my 10th best film both have 51% on Metacritic and a similar score on Rotten Tomatoes. That's insanity. My 10th worst film of 2020 is by Henry Joost and Ariel Schulman, who I think have the mighty track record of Paranormal Activity 3. Who thought that they would be good as the people to helm an $80 million action film on Netflix? I don't know, and they weren't. Project Power, one of a few Netflix films which have gone down the route of trying to, I think the first one was Bloodshot with Van Diesel, which I didn't dislike, and the other one was a Michael Bay film Six Underground, which I didn't dislike too much. And they keep doing these films. Project Power, to me, stepped over the line between being a guilty pleasure and just being aggravatingly bad. It tried too hard to be trendy. They made the... Dominic Fishback was really good. She was one of the only people that was really good in it. But they kept making, like, the teenage African-American girl rap more like 3 times in the film, which was just cringe-inducing attempts to sort of garner some kind of cultural element to the movie. The music choices were poor. The theme of the people taking pills and getting superpowers from them was really underdeveloped, as was the social context of New Orleans and using impoverished black communities to trial drugs from major pharmaceutical companies. None of it really worked. Jamie Foxx was really good. Joseph Gordon-Levitt hasn't really done it for me much in films. I found it all a bit of a damp squib. It kind of built itself up but didn't have anywhere to go. It was a bit reductive. The denouement wasn't that interesting, and they just missed out on a lot of things they could have done. It was really horribly edited. It was edited like a music video. So there was lots of swooping camera shots all the time, and it just got on my nerves. It was grating. My 10th worst film of the year, Project Power. My 10th best film of the year is definitely my most surprising. I think that was the doorbell. The most surprising film of the year. I have rubbished Guy Ritchie more than any other director, and he's up there with M. Night Shyamalan as the director that gets the most jobs that you just don't understand why. I thought Lock, Stock and Snatch were extremely amiable, but not very good. Since then, he has made an unending raft of terrible films, really generic, really folding back on his past films, or massively bad. My worst film of the year a few years ago was the King Arthur film, which is the worst film he's ever made. So approaching another Lock, Stock film like The Gentleman, my 10th best film of the year, I hope for nothing, and I got my favourite ever Guy Ritchie film. It's the best written Guy Ritchie film. It's the most put together as an actual piece of art, instead of just, random scene, just link them all together, put some cool dialogue in, put some funky music over the top, which is pretty much been his raison d'etre his whole career. I thought it was really well defined. It had some great characters. Matthew McConaughey is a reliable star. He was a non-entity in this film. Charles Hunnam, who I've always slagged off as being terrible and the worst thing in films, I said was excellent in The Lost City of Z, the first film I'd seen him good in. He was brilliant here, and so was Colin Farrell, and star of the show was Hugh Grant, who was magnificent as a devious press guy. I thought that other than some mess towards the end, most of it happened really, really well. It was well structured. It had long form scenes. Not all the dialogue was reliant on swearing and Cockney mannerisms. I thought it was clever, and I thought it was the best, most consistently well written Guy Ritchie film. How he bounced back from King Arthur to this, I don't know, but that was my 10th best film of the year. Now, my 9th worst film of the year. Yeah, it's one of the few this low rent in the list. It's The Owners by debut director Julius Berg. And it's just a home invasion film, the similar thing where you've got a couple that are tormented by people breaking into their home over the course of a movie. Here, it's just so aggressively, gratingly annoying. Everyone's actions are stupid. The guys in it are terrible actors. I think Maisie Williams is being held up as some, next big teen star, even though she's probably 28. She's all right in it, but the guys are so bad that you really are happy when they die because they're so grating on screen. It's very messy and it's extremely uneven. And it has a flip side where the couple are actually, part of some cult, and it's really them actually end up torturing the home invaders, but it's just not done well enough. It doesn't use that element enough, and it throws in a twist at the end which will have you grasping it's so bad. So it was an aggressively bad film to sit through. My 9th best was the opposite. It was sheer class, and had it not been bought out by a streaming service, we would now be looking at an Oscar nomination for Hugh Jackman. His best performance, possibly, maybe it was Logan, maybe it's this film, but he's brilliant in this film as a gay teacher. Well, not a teacher, but someone that looks after a school, after their finances. And it was the biggest school fraud in American history, based on true story, where he misappropriated millions over the years alongside an equally awards-worthy Allison Janney. They both enriched themselves at the public's expense, but also kind of justified it all by the fact that the school had gone into the top 5 best schools in America, for whatever criteria they were judging it on. And it posed some uncomfortable sort of questions, and also a lot of self-delusion from the leads. And it was a wonderful, classy, witty, warm, engaging film where it was impossible to hate the villains at all. Steve Carell was excellent in it. It was an all-round wonderful watch. I think pretty much anyone would like it. And it sort of posed the question about people that live their whole lives pretending to be other people, which is a really good footing for a story in a film, I feel. So that was my 9th best film of the year, Bad Education. You're with Julian counting down my best and worst films of the decade, going head to head, one bad, one good. Unless I do it all too quickly, in which case I might separate them. My 8th worst film of the year is, I mentioned they're not all terrible films, they're just films that have let me down a lot in a lot of ways. And I had such high expectations for The Devil all the time. My 8th worst film of the year. I'm a sucker for the Appalachian Ozark sort of theme in movies. This had all the class in the world, all the authenticity in the locations and the lives of the people. It was redolent of that world. It was just such a ridiculously overlong, overwrought screenplay. It was very, very boring. It was near 2.5 hours, and it just posited scene after scene, and it moved on a few years, and then another few scenes, and then it moved on a few years, but there was no thread tying anything together. Most of the actors in it were pretty decent. I thought that the standouts were obviously Tom Holland and Robert Pattinson. Pattinson was excellent as a scary preacher. And Tom Holland, I've slagged off a lot. I don't really like him as an actor, but he was perfectly good here. But they don't appear until the last third of the film. You're like an hour and 45 minutes in before you get to what you would call a major story arc, which occupies the rest of the film. And even when it does do that, even though that was the best part of the film by miles, lots of incredulous things happen. People are in places where they haven't been for years and just so happen to bump into someone else. It just, it didn't make a lot of sense, and I thought that all of the story elements seemed like little vignettes that didn't thread together. I think it was from a book by Donald Ray Pollock, which got a lot of acclaim. It must have got lost in translation, because I didn't feel any connection with, the early half of the film and the latter half of the film. And if it was trying to say things about, the circular nature of things and the way that problems are passed from one generation to another, I just felt these people were completely disconnected from the previous generations. It was interminably long, very dour, very well shot and reasonably well performed by just about everyone. I thought Jason Clarke as a serial killer was a bit off. And I tell you what, that whole storyline of the serial killer really sunk it for me, because it was so out of step with their lives in this, in the hollers, in these poverty-stricken regions. And then they throw this massive serial killer element into the story, which destabilized everything. It just made no sense. So that was my 8th worst film of the year. My 8th best film of the year is by a director I've got a lot of time for, called Rick Roman War. He's done a couple of brilliant prison dramas, Shot Caller and The Felon, which I've really liked. And there's another film that he did as well, which I forgot when I was mentioning it last time, and I've forgotten it again. But he's got a great track record for me. He also did The Snitch, starring The Rock, which he's done like B movies that are elevated via class. They're always well shot. They've always got decent people in them. And I thought he's done really well with his films so far. Greenland is the best end-of-the-world meteor film since Deep Impact. Inexplicably, it wasn't released in the cinema in America, despite the fact that it did about $40 million in the box office overseas, which more than made back its budget. So why they didn't give this most 2020 film a cinema release in America, I don't know. Particularly as it was really well and cinematically put together. It was dynamic. Its strongest parts were in the first sort of half hour, where people were sort of turning on their neighbours and showing how fractured society can get in a few hours once they learn this meteor is coming to destroy the Earth. Who's getting saved, who isn't getting saved. And the lead pair were winning for me. Gerard Butler's he's kind of becoming a king of B movies a bit. Sometimes he's been really bad in really bad films. He's done a couple of B movies that have got trash where they're quite grimy. And I have actually really liked him, but I thought this was probably his best role. And Marina Baccarin from Brazil, I just adore. She's so gorgeous. She's been in a lot of stuff over the years, and she's really good and really strong as a wife. I thought the progression of the screenplay was really well handled, and I like the fact that it didn't offer, a spaceship going out to rescue us all. It was actually the world's finishing and only a few people will survive. What will that impact on society? How will people behave? And it shows the degradation and animalistic behavior of people, which in a year of the plague was really quite a timely theme. The special effects were sparing yet really good when they were used. It was quite scary. And overall, I found it a very enjoyable and very cinematic experience. So Greenland was my 8th best film of the year. We're up to my 7th worst and best films. At number 7, another of those Netflix big budget action films. And even the best ones were only sort of okay. But I think the worst of the bunch for me was actually the one that got the best reviews online. And that was The Old Guard. I don't know who Gina Price-Brycewood is, but this film had so much potential. It's obviously a franchise starter. And it gave us 2 absolutely fantastic guys. Matthias Schoenaerts, who has been brilliant in lots of film. He was in The Drop with Tom Hardy as the evil ex-boyfriend. He was magnificently scary. And possibly the queen of action movies, Charlize Theron. Now, these two could have helmed this movie and it would have probably been really good. I like the whole backstory about people being born not knowing they're invincible and they don't know why, and they just travel through history as these sort of mercenaries or good mercenaries. But instead, they cut those two into background characters and instead put Kiki Lane. This is another Netflix film like Project Power that tries so hard to go for cool cultural acceptance. So I'm guessing because she was an African-American woman, they wanted to put her front and young. And even when they went to Iraq, the unit had to be multiracial, all-female. It was so cringe-inducingly try-hard. The 2 guys that were the lead guys in it, gay guys, one's a Muslim, one's a Christian. They tried all along the film just to shoehorn moments in, like a Muslim and a Christian guy kissing. And it was just like, really? It wasn't done with any sort of subtlety. It just knocked you over the head. Kiki Lane was terrible as the lead. I found this aggressively bad. I thought the soundtrack was the worst of the year. It was continual Euro trash or Euro alt pop. Just hammering you every few seconds. I found the writing terrible. The villain played by Harry Melling was the worst villain in modern history. Worse than Jesse Eisenberg in Batman vs. Superman. Cringe-inducing. And after this operatic sort of setup to this other world, it all ended in a very sort of tepid, let's assault, a complex where they're doing experiments on people, which had already happened in 6 Underground. They did similar, where, there's these special power people that end up attacking the base where the mad scientists doing experiments on them. That was the same. Bloodshot, exactly the same story. And this did the same thing, and I just thought it wasted a potentially great premise and 2 really good stars, and instead tried to be super trendy, super social media savvy, and, get people talking about the fact we've got gay men or multiracial casting, but it was all so obvious and over the top. And it was, in the end, it was a boring film. It didn't have a very good denouement. It's a denouement I've seen a million times, and it was helmed by the worst villain in modern movie history. So that was my 7th worst. My 7th best film is the most important documentary of the year, The Social Dilemma, by Jeff Orlowski, looking at the impact of social media as an unprecedented event in world history, and one that has already seen in America the most depressed, anxiety-induced and prone to suicide younger generation in American history. And it shows a terrifying format of what is happening and why. And the fact that none of the people who formed Facebook or Twitter or any of the social media had any idea that it was going to take off like it had, or what the impact would be, and the fact that it has reshaped society so much. And it does touch on things like the impact on politics and social discourse, but also on things like now teenagers grow up and their peer group isn't these 30 kids in their class, it's thousands of people online judging them. And instead of you being in your safe haven at home, these people can bully you all the way into your bed. And the dramatic effect that this is happening on people's confidence. We've seen terrible things like a record low number of American kids are taking their driving test because they're so scared of everything. They're scared of failure. They're dating less. They can't handle all of the rejection. And you may say that this is down to, mollycoddling and everything like that, but they're bombarded all the time on social media by expectation, which has never happened to any other generation, and it's having a terrible impact on the world, and we don't know what we're doing with it, and we don't know how to mollify the negative effects of social media. It's a brilliant documentary and a terrifying documentary, and it's particularly about the effects of social media on youth and how detrimental that's been and unprecedented and how quick. So that's my 7th best film of the year. Continuing the countdown at number 6 in my worst films of the year. And it's a debut by Australian director Seth Larney, originally from South Africa, called 2067. It's a dystopian end of the world film. I said, wouldn't it be a revolutionary cinematic concept to make a movie set in the future where everything's nice? Where the world hasn't been destroyed, it's actually got much better. It's another one of these films where everyone's struggling to live in this dystopian, post-apocalyptic world. The opening's really good, the opening minute, which shows that due to mankind, it's basically stopped oxygen being produced on Earth, and every living thing starts dying. And we're at a point where virtually no one's left alive, no plants, no animals, and humans exist on this very tainted oxygen produced by a multinational. And they decide that they build a time machine and they find out 400 years in the future that the world's got better. So they want to send someone to the future to find out how they did it and bring them back. Now, it's not the most original concept to have this kind of thing, but this is really badly done. I've mentioned many times about how indie sci-fi and horror movies over the last decade have just become the pinnacle of cinematic achievement. From the A24 films with lots of horrors like The Witch and Hereditary, and so many just amazing films that are just on the cusp of cinematic achievement for me. And then you've got, Australia's just done so many brilliant low-budget sci-fi films like, I can't think of any. I Am Mother, Predestination, The Rover, and what was the other one that was really Power Up? Was it Power Up? I think Power Up. But they've just, every few years, there's another brilliant low-budget sci-fi. And against all of those films that are so well made, this was a runt, an absolute runt. The acting was off the charts bad. And Cody Smith-McPhee is someone that I haven't rated at all in films so far. He does the worst crying man baby in movie history. He's constantly in floods of tears. No one knows why. They cry all the way through this film. It's just so overwrought. Every conversation is on the verge of tears or actually full-blown tears. He's terrible. Ryan Quanten is useless as the manly guy. Deborah Mailman, she is shocking and very miscast. The cast throughout are just awful. It's very torturous to get through due to the fact that it's so overwrought and people are always on the verge of tears. It's so uneven. Everything about the filmmaking process here, apart from the excellent soundtrack and some of the cinematography, is atrocious level, and it's very cringe-inducing and embarrassing to sit through. So that's my 6th worst film of the year 2067. My 6th best is a film I reviewed last week, which is the latest by David Fincher, which is Mank, which is Herman Mankiewicz writing the movie Citizen Kane, and his involvement with the making of Citizen Kane and Orson Welles, but mainly from the perspective of a never better for me, Gary Oldman in the lead, who's definitely getting an Oscar nom. This will get so many Oscar nominations because it's about Hollywood, and also the production values are really high, like the cinematography and the music and the direction and the acting. I think Amanda Seyfried has never been better. She will get a nomination as well. I didn't have too many faults with it. I said it was a soulless film. And it is, but it's so interesting politically. He spends the film ruminating on his life throughout the 1930s, where he became friends with the guy that Citizen Kane was based on. And who was that? I'm just trying to look down. William Randolph Hearst. And it focuses on his friendship with him and the Amanda Seyfried character and how he basically did the dirty on them by writing Citizen Kane. I found it really interesting. You might find it really pretentious and annoying, but and it is soulless and it is clever people and clever dialogue all the way through. But I found the political elements about Upton Sinclair and his socialism and the way that the right-wing media and Hollywood studios got behind that to bowlerize him and knock him out of the way, I found really quite timely, quite relevant to the modern era. The usage of fake actors in, promo reels that pretended to be poor people that hated Upton Sinclair and all of that, I found really enriched the background story a lot. I found that his relationship with Amanda Seyfried, who he ended up doing the dirty on, was really interesting. And the final scenes with him and William Randolph Hearst are magnificent, and they both give each other lessons on who each other is. I found it a really interesting film. It's beautifully made. I did say that the black and white cinematography is too clean for me. I wish it looked a bit more scuzzed up and dirty and old. It's very pure, but it's such a brilliant film. That's my 6th best film of the year, Mank. You're with Julian on the Brown Note, and we've got my top 5 best and worst films of the year in a terrible year for music, films and tracks. I look at it I don't know which is worst. I think the albums might be the stronger, and tracks and film are vying for a terrible. At number 5, one of the biggest letdowns of the year, I did a review a few months ago, which was 2 versions of Daphne du Maurier's most famous novel, Rebecca, head to head. I gave the Alfred Hitchcock film a 10 out of 10, and which I've seen it over the years, but this time I was really taken by the themes that are so modern in it, given that it's a melodrama, themes of gaslighting, psychological abuse, toxic relationships. It was really, really heady. So Ben Wheatley's been one of my favourite directors of recent years. Films like The Kill List and Sightseers really blew me away. And even when it wasn't so great, like with High Rise, he was still a really interesting director, afield in England, one of the most art house propositions in modern cinema. And Free Fire was okay, but not that great. Well, he was an inspired or terrible choice for the movie Rebecca. A remake of that film, disturbingly close to the screenplay of the original and massively to its own detriment. It turns out he was a terrible choice. I said at the time, I think this film's successful because Netflix didn't set out to make a film to challenge Alfred Hitchcock's Rebecca, and they didn't set out to investigate the themes of the book. What they did was set out to make a film that would be appreciated by the 50 Shades of Grey and the Downton Abbey country house romance set. And on that level, that's all they did. They made a pretty film with pretty people, but it was a terrible film. Front and centre was the casting of Arnie Hammer in the Laurence Olivier role. He brought nothing to the table. He looked mildly annoyed. He was so unsuitable for the role of Maxim de Winter, a tortured soul with a black heart who's had these awful things happen to him and done awful things. He just didn't rate. Lily James was very anemic in the Joan Fontaine role. None of the rest of the cast were particularly good, apart from Kristen Scott Morris as Thomas, as Mrs. Danvers. She was superb. It was very, very trite. It was. I watched the two films back to back, and the weight of the dialogue in the Hitchcock version really impactful, and the weight of the dialogue in the Ben Wheatley version just didn't mean anything. It was just thrown away all the time. He relied on gorgeous cinematography, but it was very glossy to the point of being reductive. It had a detective yarn thrown in at the end that didn't need to happen, and actually plot-wise pretty much didn't happen, but they just got to show Lily James driving fast in a car to get somewhere in a moment that didn't end up mattering anyway. It was really bad, and it was such a shame to see Ben Wheatley doing something so tritely obvious with no trademark of him apart from a few seconds in the middle of the film. It was an awful film, and it was also so close to the screenplay of the original that it was really easy to pull it to shreds on every failing it had. But for someone that's such an exciting, challenging director not to even engage in a lot of the themes that are so modern about toxic relationships and psychological abuse and gaslighting, why would you not? It's a very vapid film and an awful one. At number 5, the most underrated film of the year, The Lodge. Definitely up there with the likes of Hereditary and The Witch for me. It's a film directed by Veronica Franz and Severin Fiala, and Riley Keough is magnificent. She was brilliant in The Devil All the Time as well. She's a one to watch for me, and I thought this film was an amazing take on sending someone. She's the new wife of, after we watch Alicia Silverstone blow her brains out in the opening scene, which was pretty confronting. She's the new wife, and she goes to a lodge in the middle of nowhere in the snow with her husband's 2 children from her previous wife, both teenagers. They both hate her guts, and obviously it's going to be, haunted, devil stuff. There's pictures of nuns on the wall. Nothing of the sort. What we get is something far more original and far more upsetting and weird, and it's absolutely bonkers of plot progression. It focuses on what you expect to come, and the fact that we're dealing with... I won't spoil any of it, because I really think this is the most underrated film of the year. I was gobsmacked by the fact that it didn't take the path I expected, and the path it took was so awful. It's really dark, and like the end of Hereditary, it was so bleak by the end. I loved it. I thought it was a really, really good film, so you should watch The Lodge if you like anything like Hereditary. And why hasn't it got more attention? Why has rubbish like Midsummer's got so much more attention than this film? It was excellent. It got good reviews. It just got completely ignored. And Riley Keough is definitely, she's totally different in The Devil All the Time. She's one to watch for me. I think she's Aussie. But what a great film, and what an interesting progression that completely undercuts everything you expect to see in this kind of film. So The Lodge was my 5th best film of the year. I'm doing all right time-wise. I might even have to get some more music together. You're with Julian on the Brown Note, counting down my best and worst films of 2020. And number 4, my 4th worst film of the year, is the film that was designed to save cinema. The film that was going to end 2020's cinematic drought and people being barred from going to the cinema, with a big tent picture by one of the biggest tent directors on earth, with a long gestating project. All his projects are major filmic events, and it was a complete letdown. My 4th worst film of the year is Tenet, by Christopher Nolan, who has established himself as one of the great big picture directors of this century. And unfortunately, a law of diminishing returns that's been very slow, but probably the high point of his career may have been Inception, or the in between Inception and The Dark Knight. And then there was a slight tapering off with The Dark Knight Rises, which was still really good. And Interstellar, which against Tenet looks like an absolute masterpiece. It was still, a 7.5 out of 10 film. It just wasn't an absolute masterpiece itself. But it had so much that Tenet didn't. Tenet was an incredibly dull enterprise. It would have made a much better sci-fi novella because it didn't have enough plot for a 2-hour film. And mainly because the whole backwards conceit of the film would have worked a lot better in your head, because on screen it just didn't work. It too often just looked like it was very expensive to make, but it looked like people playing video backwards. And the whole idea of it, of these bullets coming out and landing into the gun, it never really made any cogent sense as to why that would be a thing. It never seemed to mean anything at all. Like, it was even watching the scientists show them how it all worked, you're like, it doesn't quite translate to a visual experience. The things that I thought were definites in this film, no matter how tepid it was, were guaranteed to get some mind-bending visuals, and it had none. Interstellar was full of mind-blowing visuals. This had none. It was very rote visually. There was no really arresting sequences that you didn't see in the trailers. I mean, the guy going up the wall was okay, but seemed similar. The plane crashing into the airport was shown on the trailer as interestingly as it happens in the film. That's not even a particularly interesting thing. The climactic car chase sequence and heist has been done better in every Mission Impossible and Fast and Furious film, and with much more imagination. Nothing in the film worked. It was all really dreary, one note emotionally. David Washington and Robert Pattinson were fairly dull in the roles, which were very dull anyway. It was overloaded with a lot of Christopher Nolan's worst traits, namely massive reliance on exposition to explain what was going on, to the extent of almost laughing. Elizabeth Debicki, I think, is a great actress with a lot of future, but she stood out a bit for me in this, but only a tiny bit. Everything is so flat. Nothing really meant anything. And it wasn't that people, like Christopher Nolan fans, said you didn't understand it, man. I understood it perfectly. It was just really difficult to understand because it was badly written and presented. And there wasn't that much to understand about it. It was just very confusingly put together. It was amazingly rote, really. So I thought this would be a mind-bending experience, but it was the most disappointing experience. I went and watched a 70mm cut in the cinema. I thought the worst that can happen is that I'll get some amazing visuals, and I got none. There wasn't a sequence in the film that was fit to wipe the boots with the trailer from Inception, and Interstellar was a far better film. At least Interstellar had some really strong themes, a lot of emotion, and a raft of characters that you engage with emotionally. All three of those elements are completely missing from Tenet. It is the worst Christopher Nolan film and the most disappointing film of the year. At number 4 in my best films of the year, Vivarium, another film like The Lodge, which was incredibly underappreciated. I think a debut by Lorcan Finnegan. This film was him and Jesse Eisenberg, who's been very up and down in films. He's okay here, but it's not great. In Imogen Poots opposite him. They're a couple looking for a new home. They can't really afford anything, so they go to this suburban dreamscape where all the houses are manicured and look the same. And the guy showing them the house disappears, and then they can't leave the suburb. Every time they drive out, they end up in opposite the same house they've just been in. This goes on for years. They're trapped in this endless suburban environment. There are no other people. Food is left outside their door, and they never see anyone. They can't escape. It doesn't matter what direction they go in. The suburb goes on forever. And eventually a baby is left outside that they have to raise. And things get darker and darker, and we see the impact the baby has on their relationship, and they start to pull apart. This is such an analogous film. There's so many analogies in it. It is the darkest look at suburbia and a perfect dream life with your child and wife in suburbia that you could possibly have. I've not felt more distressed or depressed by the end of a film this year. It's so acidically dark. We watched Jesse Eisenberg spend virtually his whole life digging a hole in the garden trying to get to the bottom of this hole. The metaphors run very fast in this film with how people spend their lives, how having children changes relationships, the impact of this awful alien child on their relationship and the way that he behaves, the fact that children are replacing you and you're going to die and they're not even going to really care. It's got so much darkness in this film. It stops being a sci-fi film where you're looking to find out what is going on, and instead becomes this incredibly toxic, nasty allegory for the perfect dream life in suburbia. It isn't for everyone. It's so dark. Some people might want it to just be a sci-fi film and find out the mystery of what's going on, but it's bleak. And for me, I've not rated Imogen Poots, a very, very pretty actress. In anything she's done before this film, she is absolutely amazing in this film. Totally changed my opinion of her. She's brilliant in a very challenging role. Jesse Eisenberg is okay. He's a bit more in the background. He's good, actually. He's better than okay. But it's Poots' film. She is amazing as she travels through life in this one spot she can never leave. It made me feel so down at the end. It really did. But a brilliant piece of filmmaking for Varium. At number 4, and what are we up to here? With Julian on the brown note, counting down my top films of the year and my worst films of the year. Next week it will be my tracks of the year, but that won't make it onto anything other than the full-length radio show, which will be on the radio or on Mixcloud because there's too much editing and music and it won't be any point. At number 3 in my worst films of the year, a film that has made it there because it's one of the most acclaimed films of the year, though I noticed in the end of year lists it's not showing up anywhere near as much as they were making out to be like one of the best films of all time when it was released. It's atrocious. Spike Lee's The Five Bloods. Now, it was a case of the right director in the right time with the right subject. I think Black Lives Matter was kicking off and they suddenly thought, black director, black film, something. Because the film he made before that, Black Klansman, I didn't think it was a masterpiece. I think I gave it 7.5 out of 10. It was really good. This wasn't. This was terrible. 4 guys go to Vietnam in their later years to get some gold bullion that was dropped in Vietnam and steal it back as reparations for the fact that African Americans were overrepresented in being sent to Vietnam. Amazing to think that 30,000 of your fellow countrymen were conscripted based on their birthday each month during the height of the Vietnam War and sent to fight in Vietnam. Can you imagine that? Like how that was ever a thing. Can you imagine like 5,000 Australians get called up to the army every week and sent to fight in Vietnam? Amazing stuff. And the fact that they were overrepresented and treated like dirt, and poor people were as well. There isn't anything to this movie, and there isn't anything that is racially interesting about this movie. Once they've said black people had it hard in Vietnam, so we're stealing some gold to make it all better, that's the whole movie. Everything about this was naff. The first hour was amiable, but then it has another hour and a half where it's interminable. Nothing really happens. It looks shoddy. The cinematography often looked like TV. A lot of the jungle scenery looked like it was shot in a car park. The morality of it was highly questionable. The gold bullion, the $20 million they're stealing, was meant for the Hmong people, the Chinese oppressed group of people. They're stealing from one group of oppressed people to pay for themselves. It never made any sense morally to me. It was very rote, and I thought that Delroy Lindo was a really good actor. Everyone else was very average, including some of the Europeans who appear in the film. Are B grade or C grade, not even worth putting in a film. Performances so bad. It does the white saviour thing in this most black film. There are 3 white people in it that are representative of a European agency in Vietnam to clear mines. They are shown as the heroes. Going to Vietnam, none of the Vietnamese are. The Vietnamese are treated as stereotypically as they were in films 30 years ago. None of them are given the credence of any sort of nuance or sophistication. It's really bad. And the fact that this is held up as a film that is, about racial matters when it treats the Hmong people and the Vietnamese people in general, like any other racist film would have done 30 years ago. They're all stereotyped, they aren't shown as good people, and the Western white people are shown as coming in and doing good in their country and saving them. The African Americans are stealing gold that was meant for the Hmong people anyway. It was a very bad screenplay. It looked like it was shot in a car park half the time. And the acting wasn't good, and it ranged from not good to absolutely terrible. The first hour was reasonable, but the second part of the film, which was an hour and a half long, could have been done in 20 minutes. There was nothing to this film which spoke to me about race or the modern era. It had absolutely nothing on any level. It was interminably boring. And the fact that people went nuts over it really offended me, because this film didn't say anything about race, really. And the characters' behaviours in it was hardly representative of people that are doing it for African Americans. There was just nothing to the story. It was very long, very boring, badly made, badly written, badly performed, and how it got like 93% on Rotten Tomatoes, it is terrible. The Five Bloods was my third worst film of the year. I trashed it when it came out. My third best was one of the earliest high points in cinema this year, directed by Lee Wannell, who's done some good stuff, and starring Elizabeth Moss, who's done plenty of good stuff and is very of the moment, from The Handmaid's Tale and other such things. And this is a very, very modernist take on the Invisible Man story, much more interesting than I thought it was going to be. It instead focuses on those modern themes that Rebecca, the new one, didn't, which is toxic abuse in relationships, domestic violence, stalking, and it used the trope of the Invisible Man to show, this ever-present force in this woman's life that won't let her leave, and who she can't fight against, like stalkers and toxic people who follow you from one place to another. It was all very timely, very feminist. I really liked it. Elizabeth Moss was fantastic. She'll probably get an Oscar nomination. And the film deserves a Best Picture nomination as well. It's really well handled. It's got some very scary jumps, and it's got some very, like the restaurant scene was probably the most amazingly what the hell scene in a movie I've seen this year. It's really, really good. The progression of the story is excellent, and the dramatic effect that this toxic guy has on her psyche is all brilliant. It's all like metaphorical in a way. He could have been an abusive husband without being the Invisible Man. It's surprising and often thrilling. And I thought it was an all-round brilliant film, really well made from top to bottom, with great performances, great screenplay. Really good use of a well-worn trope of the Invisible Man to frame modern concerns about relationships and toxic masculinity, etc. So my third best film of the year was The Invisible Man. So my second worst film of the year, the last two both got a 0 out of 10. We Summon the Darkness is my second worst film of the year. I gave this an absolute pasting. I enjoyed it. I only watched the whole film because I really wanted to give it a massive slating, and I did, which is very enjoyable. One of my most fun reviews of the year. Directed by Mark Mayers. It is a film about three girls who go to a rock concert. There's a background of a serial killer on the loose and religion, and they go to this concert. They pick up three boys, they take them back to the house, and then the twist, which is the fact that it's the girls who are the serial killers, not the guys who you've been led to believe are going to kill them. It's the other way around. And this is the premise. This is seriously the premise of this film. The three girls are from an evangelical Christian church that has gone off the rails, and whose charismatic leader, played appallingly by Johnny Knoxville, is so bad. He looks so embarrassed. Has sent his congregation out to perform ritualistic satanic murders on people in order to scare people so they will come to his church. That's really the premise of this film, which is one of the most ludicrous attempts to look at organised religion I've ever heard of. One of the least credible stories in movie history. The fact that you would encourage people, you would actually get your congregation to ritualistically murder people to make other people scared to come to your church is just bizarre. How anyone thought that would float. They genuinely think it's a commentary on religion. It isn't. As I said when I reviewed it, it would have been a much better film had they made them Satanists. And they have like a girl in it who flips and joins with the guys. And I just thought, so she's been conned into becoming a murderer, performing satanic murderers, and then she's flipped to not being one. I mean, how malleable are these people? The three female leads in it are beyond atrocious. Alexandra Daddario, Kian Johnson and Maddie Hassan. Their acting continually consists of screaming every line of dialogue. The whole thing is basically them chasing the guys around the house. And that is the full extent of the ambition of this screenplay. I guess it could have been in the woods or it could be in a big house. Nothing interesting happens along the way. The acting is beyond, I said at the time, beyond what you would, I know I even remember saying it, it's beyond what you would accept from your own child in a school play. It's so bad. It's terrible direction, it's very boring, it adds nothing to the horror trope, but the thing that really got me is at the end it showed the titles went up and the music for T'Pau's Heart and Soul, brilliant track, that came up, and I suddenly realised it was supposed to be a parody or a satire like the Scream films, and I didn't even realise. And it's sort of like it's trying to be one of those films without defining what kind of film it's parodying, whether it's the 80s horrors like Nightmare on Elm Street or the 90s pastiche horrors of the likes of Scream. This is like Scream 12. They actually carried it on from direct-to-video to only able to watch it on your iPhone standard. Everything about it is awful. Johnny Knoxville shows up at the end. He's abysmal. It is absolutely terrible, and I gave it a 0 out of 10. I slagged off Netflix for making action movies all year, and then they turned up with some really artistic films towards the end of the year. In August, I reviewed I'm Thinking of Ending Things, my second best film of the year. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. Charlie Kaufman, a brilliant writer and director, absolutely at the top of his game. A hugely challenging film with shifting sands and unreliable narrators and unreliable reality, which featured Jesse Pinkman and was fantastic. Jesse Pinkman, Breaking Bad. Jesse Plemons was in Breaking Bad. And Jessie Buckley as the female lead is fantastic. Toni Collette is really good, and David Thewlis. And it's a really sad film. It shows sort of like this couple going to visit their aging parents, and they're having this I'm thinking of ending things sort of back and forth, and we see inside the woman's head what she's thinking, and I'll go along and meet his parents, but once we get back our relationship is over. They've only known each other for 6 weeks. It's really deep and profound. It goes into men and women in their relationships and what they secretly think and the dark thoughts you have about your partner. And then it becomes much more. It evolves into this incredible fever dream about the halfway stage where unreality kicks in, and every sort of grounding we've been standing on has changed. It would have made a great film just being a drama about this couple falling apart on the visit to. I'm sure it's happened with many couples where you do something. You know, we'll go on holiday or we'll go and visit my parents, and that is a trigger for the relationship falling apart. But it becomes so much more than that. It's a challenging film because it's quite uncomfortable in its second half as reality goes further and further away. It starts with things like her jumper changing from scene to scene, and it just keeps building in this unreality fever dream. I found it a profound film, a moving film, a really strong film about human relationships and about romantic aspirations, and then so much more profound on top of that as well. It was quite dark by the end, as was the novel, I believe. I haven't read it, but I thought I'm Thinking of Ending Things. It's the novels by Ian Reid. Was something that really rewarded me on multiple levels. There was no A to B here. There was A to infinity, and you could get out of it so many things. And the writing was so daring. The performances were really daring as they had to continually slightly adjust who they were. I've not seen Jesse Plemons as good in anything before, and I thought the film itself was really moving and sad and heartbreaking and profound and challenging and weird and original and a brilliant piece of writing by Charlie Kaufman, my second favourite film of the year. You're with Julian on the Brown Note, and we've reached number one status. So my worst film of the year was actually one of the most recently reviewed, and I did give it a 0 out of 10. It's the apex of Ron Howard's terrible Oscar bait. It's Hillbilly Elegy, an absolutely dire, laughable, cringeable, awful film with not enough story, with some really cringe-inducingly awful takes on the Appalachian Ozark themes that have become very popular in movies. I said it's a Hallmark greeting card version of Winter's Bone. I thought Glenn Close will probably get nominated for an Oscar. Amy Adams is perfectly fine, but everyone else in it is pretty naff, to be honest. And I found the Gabriel Basso, the lead character, I found his performance not really interesting, and I found his character singularly uninvolving. I didn't like the whole story of the guy leaves his family behind to become a venture capitalist, but scene on scene, it was so cringe-inducingly bad. It just didn't have anything at all to elevate the subject matter. It was so unbelievably ham-fisted. It was awash with flashbacks continually throughout the film, perhaps because it didn't have enough story to go throughout the whole film. I felt it's almost made as badly as some of those evangelical movies that they've done. It was very flat. I didn't think that the story was interesting enough to be a film. It was just, he had a bit of a bad home life and went to school. But it was really Ron Howard's disaster, because he made it such a superficial world. It was so cringy and glossy, and it wanted to be edgy and dark and grimy, and I didn't feel like I was ever in that world. I thought they did some bad things, and drugs and alcohol were a problem, and abuse and stuff, but compared to virtually anything, compared to a film that was in my worst list, The Devil All the Time, which is also in that kind of world, which was so rich in atmosphere, this had none. It was just so cringy. I think it mistook yelling for emotion as well. It was a trite film. It was embarrassing at times. I laughed at it quite a lot, which I shouldn't have done. And it thought it was worthy of Oscars, but it's got trashed critically. And I think people are saying, oh, this is elitists not liking this film. No, it isn't. It's a terrible film. It's not elite people not liking it. You would have to think the new version of Rebecca was superior to the Hitchcock version of Rebecca to actually like Hillbilly Elegy. It's the apex of Ron Howard's cloying, overly sentimental, mawkish, soppy version of emotion. And it went for every big emotional note it could do in the most obvious way it could. It was really embarrassing to watch at times, and it's my number one worst film of the year. Hillbilly Elegy, you suck. And my number one film of the year, I presaged at the start of the show. I haven't got Parasite in this year because it came out at festivals throughout last year. But one film that was only released very briefly at the very last week of 2019, but actually got an international release on the end of January, is my number one film of the year by a fair margin. It's Uncut Gems, is my number one film of the year. From the Safdie brothers, Josh and Benny Safdie brothers. Good Times had elevated their very acclaimed indie films up into getting major wide international attention with that brilliant, well, nearly brilliant Robert Pattinson starring film. Any complaints I had about that being a bit superficial was wiped out by this. Uncut Gems is a masterpiece. It is the most embarrassment the Oscars have had in recent years because it's so good in the key areas. The direction is dazzling and dynamic and cutting edge. So is the cinematography. It looks quite unlike anything else. They've got this really high resolution focus going on in the film. The soundtrack is another thing that should have won an Oscar by Daniel Lopatin, One O Tricks Point Never. Magnificent. He's worked with the Safdie brothers before. And Adam Sandler, what can you say? One of the great misanthropic anti-heroes of the modern era. The best anti-hero performance in a project since Bryan Cranston as Walter White in Breaking Bad. It's a brilliant film. I thought Julia Fox, the gorgeous Julia Fox in her debut, was a star-making performance. The basketball player Kevin Garnett was magnificent. Who knew why? And Eric Bogosian is in there as well. I hated watching it because I was suffering from anxiety at the time quite badly. It's the most stressful, anxiety-inducing experience I've ever had with a film. I was so happy when it finished, and it took me hours to get over it, but it is dazzlingly brilliant on every level. The screenplay, the directing, the sound, the music, the editing, the performances. Adam Sandler is off the charts. He is a repugnant human being. And it is so exciting, but it's so straight. Don't watch it if you suffer from anxiety, because it nearly wiped me out. It was a really, really tough film. I was counting down the minutes till it finished. But a brilliant film. My favourite film of the year is Uncut Gems. I do think it's a film from this year, even though it might have been a little bit part. It shows of last year's conversation. Most of what it did was after the 31st of January Netflix release. You couldn't see it in Australia before that. So that's my number one film in a pretty flat year, but that film would have arguably won any year. It would have certainly been in my top 2 or 3 in any year I've done this show. It's a magnificent piece of work, and the Safdie brothers have gone dramatically up from producing the really great indie film Good Times to one of the best films of the year, on a par with Parasite for me. I would have said it would be a really tough fight for me to decide which film was better. I might go with Parasite. But if I'd been reviewing these last year, my top 3 films would have been Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Parasite, and Uncut Gems. In what order, I'm not 100% sure. Ask me on any day, I'll probably change my mind. That's it. We're done. That's my number one film of 2020, Uncut Gems.